I'll just say a few words of introduction. I think most of you know EJ through his column in the Washington Post and many other places, through his appearances on television. EJ is also part of our Georgetown community. He's a professor of government and public policy. He wears another hat at the Brookings Institution and the program for governance studies. He finds time, besides all his columns and appearances, to write excellent books, and his most recent one, which just came out in June, I think, is entitled Our Divided Political Heart, The Battle for the American Idea in an Age of Discontent, which you can see already overlaps with some of the themes that we're looking at. And as a token and a souvenir of today's session, you're all going to get copies of this book. We didn't get them to you for today, but we'll send them along. And EJ just insists that you write reviews in your local college newspapers. That's all.
No, but if you want to send me critiques, please do.
So maybe EJ, how we'll proceed is first I'll ask you to say a little bit about the debate and the campaign, just because everyone's thinking about that, and then we'll shift a little bit to the survey and some of your reflections on that. Emily and Seth, two of the fellows, will provide some reflections of their own, and we'll have a sort of general conversation for about an hour, all told. But before we get started and turn it over to you, let's just go around so you get a sense of the diversity here around the table, and maybe each of you could just mention your name, where you study, and perhaps what you're studying.
And I think I met a number of you when you were here the last time, so it's good to see you again.
About half the group was here last time, so the rest are new.
My name is Josina Durat. I go to Dordt College in Iowa, and I am currently studying history.
Where is that in Iowa?
The northwest corner in a town called Sioux Center.
I've spent a lot of time in Iowa over the years because of the caucuses. I think one election, I think I could have legally voted in the caucuses. I spent so much time there. I didn't, though.
I'm Emily Atkinson. I'm a senior at Smith College in anthropology and English.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Seth Warner. I'm a junior at Vassar College in political science and religion.
My name is Tyler Bishop. I'm a sophomore at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, and I'm studying political science, communication, and corporate strategy.
See, you could both start a church. The two of you together. You could do the corporate strategy for the church.
Hi, my name is Mohammed Usman. I go to DePaul University, which is in Indiana, and I study urban policy, conflict studies, and a minor in religious studies.
Hi, my name's Eitan. I'm not a fellow, but Professor Banchoff was kind enough to invite me anyway. I graduated from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown last year, and I'm working on a global liberal education initiative here at the Berkley Center now.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Juliana DeAngelis. I'm also not one of the fellows, but I work here at the Berkley Center and helped plan this event. I'm in the School of Foreign Service studying culture and politics.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I attend the University of California, Berkeley, and I'm majoring in political science and public policy.
Have you ever studied with my friend Margaret Weir? Have you run into her at all? You should look her up. She's awesome.
Hi, I'm Zach Yenser. I'm a senior at Arizona State University studying political science and international studies with a focus in Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ryan Price. I attend Drake University, also in Iowa and Des Moines.
Been to debates there.
Yeah, and we had the debate there last fall. And I am studying politics and rhetoric.
I'm Senior Framrose. I'm a sophomore at Harvard University, and I'm studying government with a minor in psychology and Italian.
Oh, I love the comment. There are so many jokes we could make on that. Why Italian?
I wanted to be able to understand opera. I want to go to Italy for my junior year, and it's just a gorgeous language.
It's so beautiful.
It's so beautiful.
It really is. You could hear. I would sit for hours hearing people read a phone book in Italian.
Phone books, poetry. It's fantastic.
No, I lived there for a couple of years, and that's great.
Hi, I'm Ashton Adams. I am
What's
a junior.
the first name?
Ashton. I'm a junior at the University of Kansas studying international studies and African studies, and I personally believe French is the most beautiful language.
Oh, French is my first. Oh, I like that. We could.
American.
French is my first language, so because French Canadians coming over the border into New England, and while my family have been there for several generations, my parents wanted us to speak French first. And in a lot of those I grew up in a place called Fall River, and in a lot of those, there's this great sort of academic research that French lasted longer than in any other immigrant language until, with the exception of Spanish, which is more complicated, and then disappeared more quickly. But when I was a kid, about 20% of the time, I picked up the phone and it would be in French. So anyway, so I always say, forgive what I write, because I'm writing in my second language.
I'm Abigail Claus.
The first name is?
Abigail.
Abigail.
Mm-hmm. I'm a junior at Boston University, where I study religion, English, and anthropology. Also Italian.
That's great.
My name is Amir. I am a junior at Georgetown University. I'm majoring in government, minoring in theology and pre-med, and I am from Connecticut.
My name is Bryce. I'm a junior English and philosophy double major at George Fox University in Portland, Oregon, basically.
My name is Hira Baig. I'm a sophomore at Rice University. I'm studying political science.
Thank you.
So you see we have quite a diverse group here. And I know, like I said, we'd love to hear just a couple of your impressions about the debate and how the campaign's going before we launch into the survey.
I was talking baseball with Muhammad earlier. He's a Yankees fan, I'm a Red Sox fan, and I said that if any Obama supporter was well trained as a Red Sox fan this morning, because Red Sox fans went through what Obama people went through this morning over and over and over again. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that in some by most measures, Obama lost and Romney won, and I think that although I'm going to qualify that in a second. And I'm not sure this should have been as shocking as it was. I mean, I think it was surprising how laid back or disengaged or whatever word you want to use that Obama chose to be. I don't think it was shocking that Romney did well. If most of you were probably sane enough not to watch 35 Republican debates. I watched a lot of Republican debates, and I think anyone who remembers what Romney did to Newt Gingrich in Florida, where I think in the debates before the Florida primary, Romney used the debate to dispatch Gingrich, and that Gingrich was never the same after that. So you knew going in that Romney could be tough. You also knew that I'm not sure anyone has put more preparation time into a debate than Romney put into this one. He clearly knew this was going to be central to him, and he's been preparing for a very, very, very long time. More mysterious is why President Obama did not choose to be more aggressive. My impression this morning is the people who are angriest are actually liberals. I was on NPR last night, so I didn't get to see my friend Chris Matthews, but from what I can gather, he very nearly had a heart attack out of his anger at Obama for not, even just picking up on points made in his commercials or in his own stump speeches. And you asked the question, why did this happen this way on the Obama side? I mean, I think it's quite obvious Romney knew it was on the line, that if he had lost last night, this election could have really drifted very far in Obama's direction. I think the biggest losers actually are not Obama, but Democratic House and Senate candidates. That I think a race that could have become an Obama rout, or at least, I mean, the country is too polarized to have a rout on the order of 1936 or 1964 or 1984, but you would have had a very strong movement to Obama, dispirited Republicans, and I think that could have contributed, it very much increased the chances of Democrats taking the House. That looks more difficult today. I think that I can't tell, and I think it'll be interesting to see how much of the Obama performance was strategy that misfired, and how much of it was something personal. The most charitable explanation I heard for Obama's performance is that we don't know what's going on behind the scenes, and there's some horrible foreign policy crisis back there, and that's where his mind was. That's the most charitable explanation. The second is that Obama went into the debate not wanting to lose. the old prevent defense, and not wanting to make a mistake, not wanting to interfere with the trajectory of the campaign, not wanting to look arrogant or mean, not wanting to disrupt his high personal favorable rating. That's plausible, but it clearly it's a strategy that doesn't allow you to take advantage of the opportunity. You have to really put the race away, and I think it led to a kind of passivity and an unwillingness to pick up even obvious points that he could have picked up on Romney. And the other is that presidents don't spend their time being challenged by anyone, and a lot of people have noted that a lot of incumbent presidents have lost their first debates. Reagan, notably in 1984, and George W. Bush against John Kerry in 2004. And the other thing is, I have never been of the view that Obama is a great debater. And if you look at the 2008 debates, he didn't win a lot of those debates. He didn't win because of debates. I remember one distinctly in St. Anselm's College up in New Hampshire, where Joe Biden won the debate. It was far better than Obama. Other debates, Hillary Clinton won, and we all, for those who in this room would remember, you're likable enough, Hillary. That was a very unfortunate moment, and I think some of it comes when he feels more confident perhaps than he should, because at that moment everyone, including me, was certain he was going to win the New Hampshire primary, which is not what happened. So I think all these things sort of contribute to that. Now, what I also think is that Romney left, if you will, some hostages to fortune in that debate, and I think a lot will depend on how Obama and Romney deal with them over the next several days. If for those who read the Post this morning, Romney is $4 or $5 trillion in tax cuts, no matter what he said. Now, and if he says he's going to offset them all, then I don't know what kind of deductions he's going to get rid of, but an awful lot of middle-class people will not be happy because it's very hard to offset $5 trillion. And so I think there's going to be a lot of challenge on that. I think that the Obama campaign believes that they have the Medicare issue on the table in a way that could be harmful to Romney. There are other things he said about the budget, things he said about Medicaid that were either untrue or highly questionable. And so I think it'll be interesting to see in the next week before the vice presidential debate how Obama deals with them. I was, two other surprises that he talked about the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts without mentioning the name George W. Bush, which struck me as an error. Ryan's name didn't come up nearly as much as it could have. The number 47, as in 47%, didn't come up. Now, the one theory I have about that is that they felt that was doing so much damage to Romney that they didn't want to give him even a chance to explain himself. But still it was a loss. Yeah. So I think the final point on the debate is that I am still curious. These instant polls are overwhelming that Romney won the debate, but they weren't so clear on how the debate affected people's views of the candidates. In the CNN poll, which showed Romney winning the debate by a big margin, Obama's favorable went up by 1 and Romney's favorable went up by 2. And I think we're still net negative at the end of the debate. I also think there are at least some swing voters, at the risk of being stereotypical. I think particularly women voters might not have been as comfortable with the aggression, that Romney's aggression. So I'm going to be very curious over 3 days to see how this penetrates. Now, having said all that about what the polls will move, if you have the entire media saying you lost the debate and the other guy won the debate, that too has an independent effect, whether people watch the debate or not, whatever they thought about it at the time. And the drumbeat of criticism of Obama from his own side, as well as the other side, has to have penetrated the public. So it would be a great political science. I've always thought there's great political science work to be done on the impact not only of the debates, but on the interpretation of debates on actual voters.
And certainly it's good for business, right? It's good for your business. Now it's more of a competitive race. It was probably always competitive, but the drama is there. the ratings are going to be very high for the next couple of debates.
Although
It's
I'm
more
not sure,
exciting.
this
You don't think
debate
so?
was also boring.
Well, that's true.
And that, and that it was wonky without being informative in certain ways, which is kind of, I'm not sure it's the worst of all possible worlds, but, so I'm very curious if this will increase. Although I suspect you'll see a big increase in Obama supporters watching the religious among them on their knees, praying the guy does well in the next one. And it should, in principle, be a better format for him because it's a town hall format. But, as I say, I think the most striking thing is how, most surprising thing is how angry liberals are.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, EJ. And we're eager to hear some of your reactions to the survey. Have you had a chance to take a look?
Yes,
at
no, I had. First of all, how many people at this table were taken to vote by their parents? So let's do it the other way. How many were not taken to vote? Oh yeah, I was taken to vote by my parents.
You were?
Yeah, I was. Oh yeah, and I've taken my kids to vote. Now notice that probably explains a lot about this group. What do you figure? That was about 70 or 80% of you put your hands up. So. That already tells us something. I found those numbers in the survey fascinating, and the whole question of political socialization and what attitude people have toward the efficacy as a result of those experiences. I was very struck that more young people from more religious families were more likely to be taken to the polls by their parents. Catholics were much more likely. I wonder if that's because we Catholics are liturgical, or whether we all descend from one party boss or another of some kind. But also, and I'm not sure this is at all surprising, that liberal or conservative kids were most likely, then liberals, and moderates were low. And that didn't shock me at all because people who call themselves liberal or conservative are already more committed to the whole process anyway. So I found that fascinating. I was struck by, and I'd like to see, I want to sort of take the survey back and compare to the exit polls. On the one hand, it was striking, and this is what I'd like to engage you all in if I could. On the one hand, Obama still has a major advantage in among the millennials, but it's not the same advantage he had in 2008. In 2008, he got 66%, as I remember, of the under 30s, and this is in the 50s. So he's got a 16-point lead, which is not nothing, but it's not where it was. But the other thing that was very striking, which I'd also love to engage you on, is the sharp split between whites and on the one side and Latinos and African Americans on the other. And I have thought for a while. I should say, by the way, and that I love your generation, and you will see in my book that at the very end, well, the New York Times reviewer said it was a Valentine to your generation. At the very end, I argue that you are potentially the next greatest generation in our history because of you. You combine a great practicality about the way the world works with a whole lot of idealism and a real history of service. And that you resemble, and not unlike the greatest generation, by the way, you've been through severe economic times, just like they were, and also a long period of war, like they were, and you've done all kinds of you've engaged in public actions, including service, more than earlier generations. So I put a lot in you, and you could also say, I'm in the generation that left you a lot of problems and has enormous confidence in your ability to solve them, and that we gave you great opportunities to be a great generation. But I think that what is really striking is the racial split on voting, and that it does, I think it's going to raise questions about, is this actually a real generational difference? Because there are a lot of surveys that show you, in general, more liberal than older generations, obviously more Obama voting in the last election, and clearly more liberal on certain social issues, notably gay rights and gay marriage. Yet this split by race makes one think about the fact that the millennials are also, you guys, and it's reflected right here around the table, are a much more diverse generation than older generations, a lower percentage that's white, if you will, just as an analytical matter. And so how much are these numbers driven by genuine generational difference, and how much are these differences driven by demographic variations across generations? And I'd be very curious to have you engage on that. Robbie didn't get into this, but I was the Institute of Politics at Harvard did some very interesting work, as you know, their surveys. And you guys you are the perfect group to pose this question to, because there's a suggestion in the Harvard surveys that the 18 to 21-year-olds, which is a lot of, if not all of you, are somewhat more conservative than the millennials who are older than the 21 plus, wherever you want to end the millennials. And I'm curious about that. I want to see more. I'm going to be very curious on Election Day in the exit polls, and we'll have enough data actually to make the fine distinctions across age groups. Yeah. Is this about generational experience? I mean, you are, formed in so many ways by 9/11 as young people. The Bush presidency had an influence on you, but not quite as great an influence as the people older than you. I think political patterns are set often by a strong reaction either for or against a sitting president. A lot of Republicans got created in the Carter years. I think a lot of Democrats got created in the Bush years. On the positive side, a lot of Republicans were reinforced in the Reagan years. And would have been in the Clinton years, but for the impeachment mess at the end. So that I am very curious about this distinction between, if you will, your group and the people just a little bit older than you. And then you've got this awful economy that you have the good fortune of walking into, although some of you are young enough. My son is a sophomore in college, and I went to an economics presentation a couple of years ago where the conclusion was that we wouldn't reach full employment until 2015 or 2016. He's class of 2015, and I came home and I said, James, I knew you were brilliant, but I didn't know how brilliant you were in timing your birth, because you're going to be getting out just in time, not too soon, into this economic mess. But I think, again, your economic experience is very, very different than, say, even someone getting out of college in 2007, which is not that long ago. And I'm curious what impact that'll have on you, what effect that has on attitudes toward Obama and his presidency. I also just want to underscore something that I always underscore, because I think it's something that one always has to look at in these surveys, is the South is a very distinctive part of our country still after all these years. And there are some Southerners at the table, but it really is a much more conservative part of the country, and that when it seems more and more that when you look at any set of surveys, for example, Robbie did an excellent piece of work on blue-collar whites called Beyond God and Guns that came out about a week and a half ago. For those of you interested, you can find it online. And it's been said a lot that white working class voters are Republican voting and more conservative. Well, a lot of that is driven by Southern whites who are are more conservative than whites in the rest of the country. Actually, blue-collar whites, the vote is quite competitive in other parts of the country, particularly the Midwest, right, which, if President Obama prevails, is going to be a very important fact. It's why he's way ahead in a state like Ohio. And so I do think that, the Civil War was a very long time ago, and yet we still have quite extraordinary regional distinctiveness in the United States, and that's something else that really struck me in this survey. I could go on, but I think that might put enough. I think that might put enough on the table to sort of to promote a discussion.
It does, and we have two other fellows, Seth and Emily. We're going to provide some reflections, and then we can just open things up. Seth, do you want to get us started? We need a mic down here. Yeah.
First, is this on? Cool. Professor Dionne, thank you so much for coming. I thought it was particularly interesting that you cited the racial split in electoral politics, because the approach that I'm coming from is one that kind of studies the two-party system and specifically polarization. And to give some background, in the 1950s, political scientists were very concerned that there was not a firm ideology between parties, that when you voted for a Democrat or you voted for a Republican, it didn't really mean too much because, with Southern Dixiecrats and, liberal New England Republicans, there was no real firm alignment between the parties. And so political scientists said, we need a stronger alignment, a stronger ideological base for these parties so that voters know what they're doing. And even then in the 1950s, that concern was based off of race. And it's an example of you have to be careful what you wish for, because now, yes, in 2012, we are dealing with record-breaking amounts of polarization. Whether that polarization is among political elites or if it's among predominantly the voters, that's a topic of debate. But the polarization right now, is, if we look at Congress and the executive, is crippling to the American system. And again, and electoral studies, including this survey, seem to suggest that a large part of that is race. There are really three significant cleavages in the American electorate. The first one, of course, is class. That's always been a cleavage. That makes up about 20% difference between how you vote. Lower class individuals are 20% more likely to vote for Democrats than are upper class individuals. Second is religion. That's another 15-20% gap. However, and I know this is kind of contrary to the assumption that religion scholars in the survey focusing on religion has made, but there is some evidence and studies suggesting that it's not so much religion driving your vote, but more so your politics driving your religion. And what I mean by that is because religion has become so intertwined with politics, people consider themselves less religious because of their political beliefs. Someone who might believe in God or otherwise be religious would say, yeah, but I don't really go to church because I feel like that's a Republican-y thing to do. Or alternatively, I'm not so sure about God, but good conservative Americans go to church, and so I will too. And so I'm not really sure how salient religion really is as an electoral cleavage. The most important one is race. Between whites and Hispanic voters, there is a 30 to 35% electoral cleavage. Between whites and African American voters, there is a 50% electoral cleavage. Barack Obama got 95% of the black vote in 2008, and you might say, well, that's because Obama's black. But no, John Kerry in 2004 got 92% of the black vote. Meanwhile, white voters have not voted for a Democrat for president since 1964. And right now, only 40% are voting for the Republican voting for the president for re-election. So race is really the most notable cleavage in electoral politics today. And I think it will be the most pivotal as we expand and in regards to the two-party system and polarization, because that gap is expanding. It's not expanding in that, the electoral cleavage is becoming wider. At 95%, blacks can't get any more Democratic. It's expanding because there are remarkable tensions over issues of race. In the survey we saw that there was a 50% gap between whites and non-whites regarding should government install programs to redress past discrimination. There's a 50% gap in that, a remarkable tension between whites and non-whites among our generation. And moreover, non-whites are quickly growing in the American population. Right now, slightly less than half of our generation is made up of non-whites. By 2050, the majority in this country will be non-white. And so if non-whites are voting more than 3/4 for Democrats, and there's still a little less than half of whites voting for Democrats, you have to ask what's going to happen to the two-party system. Because if this continues, by 2050, the Republicans will consistently get 1/3 of the vote, and you don't want elections that way. So ultimately, we have to say, something's going to happen. And it's going to involve race because that's the only place that the Republicans are going to get more votes. And there are really three things that I can think of, and I know that this will open us up to a lot more debate. The first two I'll kind of throw away. The first one is the Republican Party will die. I can't see that happening. I think our two-party system is very permeable. Something will have to happen before the Republican Party dies. The second is that perhaps I'm underestimating an economic cleavage. Perhaps African Americans and Hispanics vote more Democrat because they're lower income on large. But I don't think that's the case because those cleavages are much wider than our existing economic cleavages. So that doesn't seem to make sense. What I think will happen, and it could be something entirely different that I haven't mentioned at all, but what I think will happen is that we'll have to see some sort of iffy coalition government in the Republican Party. And the only place I can see that happening is through religion. As we saw in the survey, minority voters, although they are overwhelmingly Democratic, they are also overwhelmingly religious in a way that white Democratic voters are not. White Democratic voters are generally secular. There's a majority among Catholics, but for the most part, it's more secular white voters among our generation who are voting Democrat. So really, the only connection right now between Republicans and minority voters of our generation is religion. And what I think that will look like 50 years from now, and I know it's a little pretentious for me to say what American democracy will look like 50 years from now.
Well, at least you'll be alive, which is unlike some of us.
No, you seem healthy. But
God willing.
That's right. But I think what you'll see is that there will have to be some sort of connection in the Republican Party whereby you will have a white base that is both socially and fiscally conservative, and then you will have a non-white Republican base which is socially conservative as part of their religiosity, and fiscally liberal. There are problems with that hypothesis too, because we see among millennial non-white voters that on social issues such as gay marriage and abortion, they are more liberal than are their older non-white peers. There are also, because that significant racial tension is exponentially larger among Republicans, that would be a significant gap that the Republican Party would have to get over in order to make something like that happen. It may never. But I think, ironically, going back to how that race creates electoral polarization, that in the 1950s we were concerned that they would have kind of iffy coalitions whereby you wouldn't really know what you were voting for when you're voting for a Democrat and a Republican. Now we know all too well what we're voting for, and if something like this happens, it would go back right to where we were 50 years ago, except with the other party.
That was great. I'm going to wait. I want to hear both, but that was excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Emily. I just want to say thanks again for being here. I'm going to take us in kind of a different direction and talk a little bit about religion, some more about religion, but not so much in the future as right now. It's okay. When I was reading the survey, something that interests me a lot is the continued resistance to a president who is either Muslim or atheist, Mormon resistance is decreasing among the general population and particularly among millennials. And I'm really not entirely sure why this resistance is so strong, especially when about half of millennials don't say that religious beliefs are particularly important in a presidential candidate, yet they would be uncomfortable with a Muslim or atheist or perhaps a Mormon president. And actually, last night at watching the debate, something that in connection with this that struck me was the one line that got boos during the entire thing was when Romney started to talk about everyone being children of one God and how we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. And the reaction to that was extremely strong. I know it was a college Democrats showing, but there were people cheering for Romney's lines throughout the rest of the debate. And a friend of mine at Smith, which is also very liberal, but noted that people had freaked out a lot at that line, and she could hear them even in other houses. But the thing is, I know not all of these people are atheists, and probably most of them are some kind of Christian denomination, because that's the breakdown of the United States population. So I'm wondering why there was such a strong reaction to this, particularly when Lisa Miller actually had written in one of the articles that we got in our packet about the need for Obama to use more God talk. But I wonder now how alienating that is, not only for people who don't have a God, but for people who see their God as different from Romney's or Obama's, when either of them says that we are all children of one God or refers to a God that we are all supposed to connect to. A lot of people don't seem to be connecting. To an extent, they both do need to do it because most of the United States, again, is Christian. And I think for Romney especially, he's very concerned about a lot of Christians thinking that we are all children of the same God so that they'll support him. But at the same time, we've become a much more pluralistic country, and our generation in particular is far more pluralistic than previous generations, just in our own makeup. And Obama's recognition of non-religious people was an enormous step forward. But it seems we may be retreating a little from that in the rhetoric that the campaigns are using. During the Republican primary, we heard people saying they wouldn't have a Muslim in their cabinet, that people without faith are not trustworthy on national television, and there wasn't the outcry that I thought such statements might garner, and perhaps because even people as young as we are and as exposed to as many different viewpoints as we are would still not be comfortable with people without faith or of certain faiths being in the positions of power in this country. And yet we're booing this line that isn't extremely I think it's controversial. A lot of us think it's controversial, but among the wider populace, I don't think that saying these things is particularly outrageous. And I don't really know the answer to this paradox, as Hira was talking about. We have a lot of paradoxes in our generation, partially because I think we are still working out who we are and what's important to us. The previous survey last April noted a tendency among millennials that was pretty strong, if I remember correctly, to believe that we shouldn't legislate public morality, that the government shouldn't be involved in matters of personal morality. We obviously support same-sex marriage very strongly, and seem to think that abortion is more of a private concern and shouldn't be outlawed. That basically we want the government to stay out of our business, but to support us more strongly. Now that I'm actually sitting here and thinking about this in connection with what we talked about this morning as well, I wonder if potentially this kind of God talk is part of why we also think the government is the government and not our government. If politicians in power maybe seem to be different from us in that regard as well, or I also think that even people who are religious, who do share the same God as Obama or the same God as Romney, perhaps on behalf of friends who they know do not feel alienated by these kind of statements, that we have a lot of loyalty to each other as a generation. We kind of feel that we're in this together with the economic situation and having grown up after 9/11. And perhaps we see the government as in opposition to us in a lot of ways, and this isn't really helping. Anyway, that's about what I'm thinking right now. I've had a lot coming in this morning that sort of changed what I wrote down, so it's not necessarily applicable, but yeah, I think I'm done.
Thank you very much. EJ, do you want to? Yeah, those were excellent presentations, and they raised all sorts of wonderful issues. Emily, just on the notion of God, and it also goes to what Seth said, which I think is so important that we don't look at enough, which is the extent to which the religious engagement in politics is actually not about religion at all, but about our party. There's a great C.S. Lewis line where he said we look to the scriptures not for guidance in how we should think about political questions, but we ransack them for support for our own political party. And I think actually a lot of religious people on all sides, not just religious conservatives, but religious progressives, need to sort of look at their consciences more than we all do and wonder, are we really talking about religion, faith, and what God says, or are we simply reflecting a partisan view? And I think there's a lot of evidence that religious groups are now polarizing along political lines. I mean, in the Catholic Church, increasingly you can find liberal and conservative parishes, which is not something that used to be the case. People are leaving denominations that are more politically conservative to join denominations that are more politically liberal. Is that about God or just about our politics? And so I'm really glad you put that on the table. Now, this is not all new. It's one of my favorite political jokes about Mrs. O'Reilly, and she is being taken to the polls by her son. And Mrs. O'Reilly has always voted straight Democratic, and her son has gotten fairly well-to-do and calls himself an independent but votes for a lot of Republicans. But he takes his mom to the polls every year, and he asks her mom, how are you going to vote, as they're on their way? And she says, as she always did, straight Democratic. And the son looks at her and says, Mom, if Jesus came back to earth and ran as a Republican, you would vote against him. And Mrs. O'Reilly looks at her son and says, oh, hush, why should he change his party after all these years? And I've always said that one of the dramas of American politics, a lot of Americans think he has changed his party after all these years. And I think in terms of the millennials, one of the ways in which you are very distinctive is that you are separating yourself from organized religion to a degree, much greater degree than earlier generations did at your age. In other words, there's a tendency to be less religious, certainly less engaged with religious institutions when you're in your 20s, particularly in your early 20s. But it's not just, this is not simply a change by age group. This is a change over time, where compared to people like in your age group 20 years ago, you are much less given to loyalty to a religious institution or a church or a faith tradition. And I do think there's a lot of evidence that this too is driven by politics. For those of you who haven't read it, Bob Putnam's enormous book, but nonetheless worth reading because it's just full of fascinating data, American Grace it's called. He argues that one of the things that is pushing the younger generation away from organized religion is, in fact, politics, an association of religion with conservative politics, when many spiritually inclined young people are not inclined to be particularly join Christian churches because they see them as representing conservative values. And I think particularly issues around gay rights, to some degree abortion, although the other fascinating thing about your generation is that you're not really all that different from your elders on abortion. You're very different on gay rights, which I think shows a really interesting moral discernment. And this is particularly true among young evangelicals who are less sympathetic to gay rights than other young people, but much more so than their parents, yet their views on abortion are identical. In some ways, there's some evidence even that your generation may be a little bit more pro-life than people older than you, taken as a whole. Seth, I loved your bringing up, some of you may look at this, may look this up online. You're bringing up the old political science argument. And my friend Tom Mann at Brookings and I have actually been thinking of going back to the American Political Science Association study. This is what you should look up online. It was a famous piece called Toward a Responsible Party System. And all these political scientists were bemoaning the fact that the parties didn't mean anything, they didn't have any ideological content. And guess what? Our parties now have real intellectual content, and now there will no doubt be a new report on the dangers of political polarization and ideologically pure parties. But it's a really interesting, be careful what you wish for, or as the philosopher Joni Mitchell, the folk singer, said, you don't know what you got till it's gone. So I think it's just an interesting debate, and we seem never quite happy with what we have in our party system. I have a piece that I put up on the Post website yesterday that you might want to take a look at on this whole demographic issue. Very important book written in 2002 by John Judas and Marie Teixeira called The Emerging Democratic Majority. Unfortunately for John and Rui, their book was published, and then the Republicans won the 2002 elections. If they had only put that book out about 2 years later, or right after the 2004 election, would have been the perfect timing. But their point is your point about demographic change in the country, and that the Republicans long term are looking at a fairly bleak picture if they remain only the party of whites, and particularly older whites. It's even more restricted than that. What Rui and John note, not only the point you made about the growing number of Latinos, the Latino, African American, Asian share of the American population, where the Republicans can't win at their current levels of support, particularly among the Latinos. Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator from South Carolina, was quoted a few weeks back saying, we can't manufacture enough angry white guys to stay in business. And as you know, Lindsey Graham's a conservative. And I think that's a particular problem for Romney because of his stand on immigration, which he sort of took in response. He needed to get to the right of Rick Perry on some issue, and that was about the only one he could get to his right on in the primaries. But I think that also plays into the Democrats' electoral college advantage. And that Ron Brownstein, a really great political writer for the National Journal, refers to the Democrats' blue wall. And if you look in the last 20 years, Democrats have never gotten less than 251 electoral votes, even in defeat, whereas Republicans have gone as low as 159. The average in their 3 losing elections was 166.6. And even if you bump those numbers up a little bit because the Republican states have gained, it's not 251. So there is a kind of structural advantage to Obama in this election, which is odd because the Electoral College, as a general proposition, gives a structural advantage to smaller rural states, which tilts the thing a little toward the Republicans. If you think of the Dakotas, Wyoming, Idaho, not as reliably Montana, Alaska. These are extra electoral votes based on very small populations. But because of the distribution of Latinos and young professionals, there are a whole lot of formerly Republican states that are now swing, and a whole lot of swing states that are now solidly Democratic. So that California used to be a swing state. Ronald Reagan was governor of California. That is, it's so Democratic that Democrats won everything in the 2010 elections. If a Democrat can win in 2010, it's hard to see when they can lose. Illinois is another case on that side. The swing states, Virginia had not voted Democratic until 2008. The last time it voted Democratic was 1964. But Virginia is not the same Virginia anymore because of, again, African Americans, Latinos, and an in-migration of professionals right over the river here. North Carolina, same story. Florida, everybody lives in Florida now. And only God knows what the electorate of Florida will be like from election to election, given the age of the Florida electorate. So that I think your presentation is fascinating. Last thing is your notion on religion. I think that there is a candidate who tried to do exactly what you are suggesting, and his name was George W. Bush. And there is a great essay by a historian called Gary Gerstle. It's in a collection. You can, if you Google it, you'll find it, Gerstle. And he argued that Bush was engaged in the multiculturalism of the godly. And if you go back and look at what Bush was talking about with compassionate conservatism, he was very pro-immigration. It's a real difference between Bush Republicanism and the current brand of Republicanism. But he was acutely aware of, among other things, A, how important the Latino vote was to the future of American politics, and B, how religious American Latinos are. And Bush got the Republican share of the Latino vote up to 40% or a little more, depending on what you want to look at in the exit polls. And he won overwhelmingly among Latino Protestants. I've told my Republican friends, if you want to win the Latino vote, send a lot of people in to convert them into being, more of them to being Protestant. They've lost all those votes because of their stand on immigration, but the multiculturalism of the godly, I think, is potentially a promising course, though I don't think it's so promising. They've tried that with the African American vote. And while Bush did get his share to 16% in Ohio, partly because of the gay marriage referendum, so their share, my memory is Bush got 11 in 2004. You can get it to 11 pretty easily. But the Republicans used to be able to get up to 20%, 18 to 20% of the African American vote, and Richard Nixon got a third of the African American vote in 1960. So I think they can move those numbers some. They'll clearly do better after Obama's gone. But I think this strategy has more of a limit in the Republican Party simply because of historical memory about civil rights and the new voter ID, voter suppression laws. Depending on your point of view, I'm on the suppression side. I'm against suppression. I call them voters. I call them voter suppression laws. I mean, I think they keep doing stuff that makes it harder and harder for even African Americans who might be quite conservative, even more conservative on economics, to vote Republican. But I think this will be very important with the Latino vote. So those are two great presentations, and now I know how smart all these people are and how brilliant the selection process that Tom oversaw was.
They're not going to disagree with that. Why don't we?
Honest pandering works.
I'd love to have as many people who would like participate, add some comments, just based off what you've heard from EJ, from Seth and Emily, other topics that relate. I noticed we're focusing a lot on race and religion, which are critical, but the class issue that Seth raised, and which seemed like it was going to be a hot issue several months ago, is also something we might want to bring out in the discussion. We have a mic here. Maybe Emily, you could just pass it to your right. We'll go all the way around so everyone has a chance who wants to speak. Yeah.
By the way, the class issue, notwithstanding last night's debate, I think is still very much alive. I mean, the response to the 47% was really striking. And what especially struck me, just one quick point, is many conservatives were upset by that. If you go back, Mike Gerson, David Brooks, Chris Caldwell in the Financial Times, Henry Olsen over at AEI. I mean, there were a lot of conservatives who. Yeah. So I think the class issue is by no means dead, but even if it went into hibernation in last night's debate.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that last point you just made. So I have a question with respect to. So we've been talking a lot about, in many ways, about fixed boxes in a certain respect. Particularly your discussion about race. Now we're assuming homogeneity within race. The New York Times did a series several months ago, and we talked about the rise of sort of interracial marriage, interracial relationships, and certainly we've all talked about our generation being very interactive among numerous sort of knowing people of different racial backgrounds, economic backgrounds, so on and so forth. So how does pollsters or how do sort of politics of the future or any sort of predictive analysis reconcile against those sort of very fixed categories, how the Hispanic bloc votes, how the African American bloc votes, how the white bloc votes, when we deal with things such as sort of multiculturalism or multiracialism, in a sense where people are mingling with each other. And then the other thing is that, I'm sure as you all know, the Pew put out a poll, I think maybe at this point it was a year ago, and it talked about the decrease in religiosity among Americans as a whole, and in particular decrease of religiosity among our generation. And that's sort of a striking thing to reconcile with sort of the two prevailing trends that, between both of our presenters, one was religion, one was sort of race. But in one respect, we have, sort of a multiculturalism of race. And in another sense, we have sort of an apathy toward religion, not just institutional religion, but just religion, period. I mean, I mentioned this briefly earlier, President Obama acknowledged non-believers in his inauguration speech. So these seem to be sort of confounding trends with respect to the categories and labels that we place upon or how we analyze the Democratic electorate. And whether or not it'll play in the advantage of one party or another, I mean, that's really a question for interpretation, because I think the molds or, templates we use to make extrapolations or interpretations seem to be somewhat anachronistic or perhaps even obsolete, or at least could be obsolete. Now, I just would love to hear some additional feedback on that.
I'm going to collect all your brilliant thoughts and then try to respond. That allows me to evade any really hard questions.
I just want to respond to Seth and Emily. First of all, I think, Seth, you made a good point, and I think it's actually very likely, because I think if you look at among Latino voters, the one overarching issue is immigration. And I think if immigration reform happens, a lot of Latinos will actually flock more to the Republican Party, especially because of social issues, because Latinos do tend to be a lot more religiously conservative. You can look even in the findings. And I think the other big minority group to watch out for are Asian Americans. Because I think so far they aren't really looked at, because there are a lot of trends in among Asian Americans, a community I come from, obviously, about glass ceilings, about not being involved in politics. But I think as Asian Americans are growing, and they're going in swing states like Virginia. Romney has has been reaching out to a lot of Asian entrepreneurs and businessmen trying to sell his whole vision for his economic policies. And I think you look at Asian Americans, they tend to actually be more conservative than the general population as well. So I think there's actually a lot of inroads to be made among racial minorities for the Republican Party, which I think can be a good thing. The other thing, especially regarding religion for me, coming from an evangelical Protestant background, Ross Douthat at New York Times, he released a book this last year, I think called Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics. And his one of his main ideas is that we've conflated, especially with the rise of the moral majority in the 80s, religion and politics to a large extent. I would say, however, coming from myself being more conservative on social issues, being more traditional, I think you need evangelicals, you need Christians, you need whatever religious affiliation in both parties. But I do wonder sometimes, coming from my own religious specific background, being very conservative in terms of my interpretation of the Bible and things like that, if there are constraining elements on our politics and if that is a bad thing, because the way I approach my politics are grounded in my religion. But I'm still a Democrat. I'm an evangelical Democrat. I think for me, I hold very fast to conservative social policies, but I also look at the teachings of the Bible, and I think that does not square with me with Republican economic policies at all. So on the issue, I think, of institutionalized religion, my opinion is sometimes among our generation, we tend to be too anti-institutionalist. David Brooks, New York Times, he had a really good article I liked this past week called The Conservative Mind. If that's what republicanism is, then I would become a Republican instantly. He said some very good things, but I think one of the things that stuck most with me is life is a line of daring ventures from a secure base. And I wonder if now that we've become so much a generation of not really believing in any institutionalism, any institutions, what then holds us together? What, whether it's social institutions, whether it's the church, whether it's any religion, how do we go moving forward? I think that's an important question we need to ask.
I just want to say you just quoted two of my favorite conservatives, both as thinkers and as human beings. So
Zach? Yeah. Sure. One of the paradoxes that our generation represents, I think, is this dislike of being labeled, while at the same time being so focused on community. There was a PBS article that you did right around, I think, July 4th, Professor Dionne, where, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong on this, you started by substantiating that our American tradition was a successful combination of independence and liberty on an individual level and on a national level, with a focus on community, and how that we have divided that, where it's either you are focused on community and you're focused on community welfare, or you're focused on free market and liberty and what all that has become, and they've kind of categorized along that. And I wonder perhaps if that substantiates why we do what we do as millennials. I think this report does a great job at outlining what we do, what we think, what we believe, but not necessarily the context of why we are and why we do those things. I think our generation is extremely focused on community and community welfare, thus our support of the Buffett rule overall. But at the same time, I think that a lot of our developing suspicion of religion is that label, is that, well, if you're a conservative Christian, you are a Republican, period. And so you get someone like Daniel who sort of is a mixture of both, who kind of defies those labels, but you get a whole lot of people who aren't going to come to church anymore because they have certain social views that don't line up with the church's position. And so I thought that was a really interesting paradox to hit on.
Thank you. You remembered that right, and I could use, that's the theme of my book, and I could use the rest of the time to promote my book, but I won't. But I thank you for bringing it up.
I think we've already got it, right?
Yeah, right. So yeah, you're there.
I will
There's a shrewd market actor there. Yes, it's a waste of time now.
I need my time. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I essentially ditto what I just think. I just really appreciate all the insights that are being shared, and I especially like Daniel's point. I would suspect too, as immigration becomes less of an issue or immigration reform occurs, what Seth is talking about, the religious element of the Latino community might move more to the right and kind of change the projection that you lay out. But I also think in the thread of this anti-institutionalism that we're seeing in our generation, we have the title of our survey report is diverse, disillusioned, and divided. And I think the disillusionment might not be the most accurate of labels to apply to our generation. I think something more along the lines of skeptical might apply more, and that might weave its way through the anti-institutionalism that we're seeing when it comes to the fact that 12% of millennials label our government the government instead of our government, as opposed to a much higher amount for non-millennials. Along with that, some skepticism on marriage and the institution of marriage and traditional marriage, I think, is fueling our view on same-sex marriage. When it comes to affirmative action, too, I think affirmative action, since it is enshrined, there's an amount of skepticism to the way we view affirmative action. And I think, too, we're also a little skeptical of the American dream, in the sense that I think we are talking about class-based affirmative action and the role that socioeconomic status plays in your American dream and in your American story much more than previous generations. And that might be one reason, instead of having the civil rights movement, we have the Occupy movement that young people are so involved in. And so I would just I would say that skepticism might be a more apt label for our generation than disillusioned.
It doesn't start with a D, though.
Yeah.
But you're right. I'm glad you caught that. Yeah.
Oh, alliteration. Thank you, everyone. It's been really great to hear what everyone has had to say. When Emily and Seth were talking, I was writing down things about race and religion, and I actually wrote down gender as well, because I think it's one of those things where I think the three sort of go together. Now, Seth, you talked about how race in general is going to become less salient because the racial demographics are changing. It's going to be a less present thing in our society. And Emily, you talked about how atheism and greater diversity in religion makes it less present in society. People don't seem to think that gender matters as much anymore. More women are going to college, in fact, overtaking men in terms of the sheer numbers. And so, by all statistics, these things don't matter. But I think, as a millennial, and definitely as someone who reads the news, these three areas are still ultimately enormously salient in determining what values the millennial generation has. And I wonder, as they change physically, as these demographics change, where is our generation going to be looking to for our values? Are we going to look to religion, or are we going to dismiss it altogether because of its close alignment with conservative politics, which our generation seems to have something of a distaste for? And I think that it's going to have an impact on two main areas. First is the future of the right itself, and Seth, you talked about that a little bit, but Theda Skocpol wrote a fantastic book about the Tea Party that looked at what the right is really becoming right now, and whether or not it really is a unified entity or simply just fragmented views that keep deterring different small groups of people so that it's just one heterogeneous fragmented group. I think it's also going to be interesting to look at social policy and how social policy changes as we don't look to religion, as we don't identify gender as a key divide between our generation anymore. And I wonder where we're going to find the source, the secure base that Daniel mentioned, to find what we really believe in terms of social policy. And I guess I wanted to talk about millennials and the future of us as a group, because I'm not sure there is something that's unifying between all of us. Maybe the trademark of our generation is that we are entirely different. But any number of psychological studies show that it's easier to be a beehive than it is to be a bunch of small colonies living alongside each other. And I wonder then whether not being able to find common factors between us all the time will mean we're less successful as a generation. I'm really scared to say that because I know that's going against the Valentine letter you wrote for all of us. But it's one of the fears I have, is that our generation doesn't necessarily have a distinct view of what we have as a moral value and a moral compass.
I'm not taking away my Valentine. And I was
Not yet. Wait till we get around the table.
And I was waiting for somebody to say the word gender, so thank you.
Okay, a few of the points that I was really going to focus on have already been discussed, so I guess kind of got groupthink going already here. But I think it's really interesting. We've talked about the growing intermingling of races and religions and whatnot, and so I feel like you have a lot of commonality between previously incredibly distinct groups, and so just my one point I'd really like to say is I feel like it's not so much that we're anti-institutionalist, anti-label. It's more that the labels we have just don't fit. They've become very rigid, and they aren't changing with our generation, and so we're looking for ways we can describe ourselves, define ourselves, and understand ourselves. Like you have the Occupy movement, which brought in a whole diversity of opinions. You have, for example, I've done a lot of work in gender studies, and there's been a real fragmentation of the feminist movement. There are lots of prominent scholars who no longer identify as feminists. They identify now as, say, womanists. And so because the labels that we have don't fit, and we can't seem to get the public to change them. And so I think it's more we're just looking for our labels, not that we're rejecting them entirely.
By this time tomorrow, we have to have some labels. All right.
New labels.
No pressure. Well, we talked a little earlier about class, and I kind of wanted to bring it back to that again, partially because that's what I wrote my 3 blog posts on this summer for the lead up to the symposium.
Where did you grow up, out of curiosity?
South Carolina.
Whereabouts?
Charleston.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
No, I was thinking of what kind of town might make you think more class. But yeah, Charleston has a lot of different things going on.
When you were talking about Lindsey Graham, I was like, feeling it. Okay, so I think it's interesting that even though, as we were talking earlier, our generation has a lot of divides on our opinions, like racially, there's a whole variety of opinions, and also religiously, but one place that's kind of consistent is in our ideas of economic inequality. And you saw this in the survey. The majority of millennials support the Buffett rule. The majority of them think that business has way too large a role in the government. And then, as we've been mentioning, there was the Occupy movement and lots of thought and opinion on this issue of economic inequality. So I think that that's one place where our generation can find a commonality, and even regardless of what your race is or whatever, we can agree on this. So in the survey, we saw that people were generally against affirmative action. But I wonder what the statistics would look like if it was affirmative action based on socioeconomic circumstances instead of racial divides, because I think that as a generation, we may have moved past the idea of racial divides and racial inequality, but still have this idea of economic inequality that we can all gather around.
Thank you.
So I want to go back to the issue of religion and politics. Many of us said that one of the reasons why our millennials or our generation seems to be going away from religion is because of its conflation with politics. But actually, I don't think that. I think the reason why people aren't that interested in religion is because the narrative that is portrayed. I mean, everywhere you look in the world, you'll see examples of how religion creates divides. I mean, even in this country itself, I mean, you can see, like we've talked about so much, like with Seth, you were saying, I agree with you very much that religion is probably one of the most salient divides that we have right now. And I mean, that pretty much explains like the whole anti-Muslim and the shooting at the Sikh temple this summer, the events in the Middle East. All of these are divides based on religion. And the examples of religious cooperation that we do see are just not really that present. They do exist, but the media just doesn't seem to pick up on it. And I mean, that's a lot of us here are involved with like interfaith relations, interfaith cooperation. And like, in my opinion, I think that's what's going to get people to really come back to religion, is to see that religion is not just a force for division. I mean, a lot of the work that we do is getting people to talk about issues that are really deep and personal to them, but still be willing to accept other people's points of view. Like, not necessarily change your own beliefs, but you can become stronger in your own belief by talking with other religions. Like, me and Daniel had some great conversations last symposium about how, like, you can be interfaith but still have, like, your own identity. And I think that's going to be the way that we can really kind of bridge these divides, because if you can see that religion does not always have to be divisive, there are opportunities that you can use religion to do good things. Like, we do a lot of interfaith community service here at Georgetown. That was one of our main things last year. And we did see a lot of people who normally wouldn't communicate with each other coming together because they all had the similar moral compass, even if they didn't have the same theology. So I think that's probably the next, like, major avenue that we can pursue in order to kind of bridge these divides.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just had 2 observations, one stemming both from race and then religion, and more broadly philosophy. I think, first of all, to race, and both of these observations kind of have to do with the paradoxes we've already identified. I find it really weird that, and I mentioned this morning, that millennials are, they're jaded in terms of the government's ability to do well for them because of their age. They feel disconnected from the process, but at the same time, they feel that has nothing to do whatsoever with race, gender, and I'm going to go ahead and presume other common qualifiers like sexual orientation, things like that. And I just think that's really weird. And for as progressive as a community as the millennials seem to be, that seems so bizarre, like the almost post-racial implications of the belief that we don't need, this doesn't hold me back, but then then we thereby don't need affirmative action. I just think that's so weird to me, and I think that's a tension that'll have to resolve itself, because even when we've talked about, like, well, there's affirmative action for socioeconomic reasons or for racial reasons. Well, that's not really a divide you can make very neatly, especially because disenfranchisement that happens in the United States. It's not, I wouldn't argue, I don't think any of us would say that it's because of, like, some super deep-seated racism, but it's still there, and we still undeniably have to face it. And then as to the point of religion, there's another paradox, because one interest for me is the intersection of popular culture and millennials, and like what they choose as their preferences. And for millennials, obviously care a lot about religion, and candidates should have a religion, even though at the same time, not all of them are necessarily religious. But these people who look to religion, which always ends up being Judeo-Christian or some Abrahamic religion. And what's interesting for me is 2 of the most popular films in the past few years were Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, both of which are deeply, deeply cynical films about government and society. The former ends up arguing that we need to lie for societal protection, sort of like Bush-era securitization. And then the latter ends up going back on that, but then also painting the Occupy movement or any attempt to change the government as violent anarchism. And I mean, if you look at the scholarship surrounding these films, it's actually remarkable. You get guys like Noam Chomsky and Slavoj Žižek writing really thorough analyses of these. But I think that these say a lot about our culture, but it's weird for millennials because these are really cynical films that in some ways match our cynicism about the process being able to help us. But at the same time, if religion is so important, the almost at times nihilistic philosophies of these films really conflict with that. So I think one thing for millennials too, whether it's about racial identity and how that affects us, or about how we reconcile religion or philosophy or however you want to do it, is to see, I would say, a more uniform approach to things, because as it stands right now, we seem to be contradicting ourselves left and right in a lot of ways.
That's not unique to your generation.
A lot has been said about the differences that millennials have, and in particular, a lack of a focus in terms of commonality and how that could be destructive for us in a way in terms of looking to the future in our engagement with the political sphere. And I think that that's a reason why that's interesting for me is to consider that the previous survey, the April one, stated that college-age millennials were considerably more racially and ethnically diverse than the general population. And so that, to me, makes me wonder that though there are a lot of differences there, the fact that most of us have grown up in environments and gone to school where there is a lot of diversity in terms of opinion, and like in terms of figuring out how that impacts the variety of differences we have in the way that we think, was kind of cast upon in a negative way. But I think that that's going to be our biggest strength. I can't see why us being the most diverse generation in some time would serve as a hindrance to our ability to come together and find the best solutions and the absolute best options in terms of us moving forward politically. And so while a lot of us are very cynical about Social Security when it comes time, while there's a big divide in what we think in regards to the 2010 healthcare law, I think that those differences are going to serve as our strengths, because it means that hopefully we won't be as divided by our different partisan stances and be more apt to compromise, given that we've grown up in such a diverse environment.
All right, we have time for a couple. You had your hand up a long time ago. Do you still want to say anything?
Sure, I'll be brief.
And then both of you can weigh in, and then we'll let EJ have the last word. He's got to leave at 2 o'clock, so we'll have time to try to tie up some themes.
See, there's so much I can't, I may have to be slightly late. Go ahead.
Okay, I wanted to speak about religion and then class a little bit. It's interesting that although many millennials still are suspicious about Mormons as a president, they are less uncomfortable with that than other religious minorities. And earlier, some of the fellows were hypothesizing that perhaps that's because Mitt Romney is such a public figure now, and perhaps because of interactions with Mitt Romney, Americans have become more comfortable with Mormons. But Romney has really kind of cloaked his faith a lot. It's never discussed, even by the Obama campaign. It's very, very under-discussed. So I think that's an interesting theory, but I don't know that America is interacting or discussing Mormonism more in a really substantial way now that Mitt Romney is the candidate. So that would be interesting to unpack. And then to touch on comments about affirmative action, I don't think it's true, but I think many millennials do think that we're in a post-racial age, people of color and white people. So I think that's kind of where this lack of support for affirmative action comes in. Again, I don't think it's at all true, although much improved, but I think that's what's going on. But as a university student, I see much more of a trend towards socioeconomic affirmative action. There's a lot of talk about that. You know, like the president says, like his daughters don't need the help of affirmative action policies. So I think universities really have an opportunity to pioneer the support and inclusion of all different sorts of classes. But I'll see what they do with that. But I think recognizing the value of diversity in class is huge, but are universities really willing to put money towards that? I'm not sure that they're ready to do that yet.
Kind of along the same lines. I really want to hear whether you think class-based affirmative action would be a good idea, because it makes me extremely wary, because putting things down according to numbers is not going to catch the full personality of that person. For example, my family's net income is below zero, but I would have a lot of difficulty getting financial aid because our dairy is worth $2 million. So if you're going to look at it based on how many assets they have or just income, and it can get super complicated. So.
Okay, EJ, tie it all together for us. All right.
This was awesome. You only confirm my view of your generation. It's actually one of the great things about teaching. And so the first thing I want to say is I want this group to constitute itself as the committee for the next greatest generation. And I want you to self-appointed. Yeah, well, most committees are self-appointed. You could say it's a Leninist view. But I think this is an amazing, and I loved your reference to pop culture, because it gave me an excuse to note that whenever these days I'm involved in one of these conversations about identity and how do we think about it, I am reminded of the brilliant thought of the great philosopher Keshe, who said, "We are who we are," which is always worth contemplating. And whenever I quote Keshe, my daughters are on me, because they think an old guy like me should not be quoting Kesha, and they are probably right about that. But I still like the song. The other thing I thought of as you were talking is you are jaded idealists who have a hopeful skepticism. And in some ways, I think that might be true. And that I think one of the striking things about all these surveys is those things seem to coexist. It is not like you have become so jaded that you've given up on everything or given up on public engagement. I mean, this group especially. But, in general, I think that's true. And I'm going to come back to my committee idea. Just a couple quick observations. One is, there is in this survey a deep racial split on affirmative action. And the notion that we have gotten by all these divisions and that your generation is immune from them, it's not exactly true. That your generation clearly is, I think, more colorblind because you're more diverse, and there's a lot of evidence that you're a lot more open and tolerant than older, people significantly older than you. Nonetheless, it's quite clear that some of these splits are still there. And I find myself torn on class-based affirmative action. It is my impression that most people who propose this, it usually comes more from white people than people of color, because people of color almost always say, you don't understand, we still face barriers that you don't face, therefore you don't see them. And there's some truth to that. And yet, I do think that, the class splits in our society are the most severe, and that, within clearly, for example, within the African American community, there is a growing class divide. It may actually be deeper within the African American community than in the country as a whole. And what do we do about that? And that should affirmative action, without giving up on the idea that there are still racial barriers in our society, should it take into account that there are some people who are, William J. Wilson's great phrase, that he truly disadvantaged. And, someday I hope maybe your generation could pioneer this discussion, because I don't see our ever saying that race has disappeared as a category, because it hasn't. But I think we need to take into account new realities of class division, and I wish we could have a better conversation about that. Ticking several points off, I loved your point on interracialism and interracial marriage. And there is this terrible tendency, especially for academics and journalists who study these things, we always want to box people in because the boxes can be instructive. One of my best lessons on this, and when I worked on the New York Times, the Times asked me for a while to spend some time looking at the New York City census numbers and to write some stories. And one of my favorite stories, I was looking at the self-identification of Latinos as whether they were black or white, because in the census you had the two questions, so you could see how Latinos characterize themselves. And it turned out that a majority of Latinos who lived in the Bronx called themselves black, and a substantial majority of Latinos who lived in Queens called themselves white. Now that was really interesting, and so I started trying to explore what does that tell us. And some of it is the nature of the community in which you live, Queens versus the Bronx. Some of it was the nature of the immigration. Argentinians were more likely to see themselves as white than Dominicans. But there is and the notion that a Salvadoran, a Cuban, somebody from Spain, and somebody from Chile are all in the same box. Well, they don't necessarily quite see themselves. They do speak Spanish, and they are they are presumably, for the purpose of this story, immigrants, and yet these are very different kinds of people. So, so I think there's no escaping that we'll box people in different ways in order to understand things, and I do think interracial. Mixed marriages are now very common, and we don't even think about cross-religious marriages. That used to be an enormous divide, and I think that we're moving to the point where cross-racial marriages are much less of a big deal to people than they used to be. But how do you make sense of that? The evangelical comment, I think something really interesting is happening among younger evangelicals. Again, there's a lot of survey evidence going back to putting people in boxes, where it's quite clear that younger evangelicals who are still socially conservative in many ways are significantly more liberal, progressive, moderate, whatever word you want to use, because they have a heavier focus on the importance of poverty. They're going back to the scripture and what Jesus said about poverty and injustice. And I do think there's an interesting slow revolution going on in the evangelical world that will be pushed along by younger evangelicals. Now, I still think white evangelicals are going to remain more conservative and Republican for reasons having nothing to do with evangelicalism. Many of them were conservative before. They tend to be somewhat disproportionately Southern. They tend to be disproportionately middle class. There are a whole lot of categories that tend to make people conservative. Nonetheless, I think there's a real ferment there. I won't push the book except to say the core thesis is indeed that from the beginning we've been torn by this tension, which I think is a healthy tension between our love of individualism and our quest for an affection for community. And I think our politics gets messed up when we try to pretend that we are all one thing or all the other, and that we actually succeed at better as a country when we look for this balance. And it's one of my frustrations with current politics that we don't. Somebody mentioned skepticism about marriage. I've also thought of it the other way around. Yours is the most pro-marriage generation in history, because the older generations thought that only heterosexual people should marry, and you think everybody ought to marry. And I do think it's an overlooked aspect of the movement for gay marriage. That in certain respects, this is a remarkably conservative demand, and that when it first came up, the gay movement was split about it, because a lot of gay and lesbian folks thought this is conceding to a kind of bourgeois morality that we reject. And my friend David Brooks actually wrote a really powerful column in favor of gay marriage, where he said, I am deeply in favor of fidelity and commitment as a central value, and therefore I not only support gay marriage, I demand gay marriage. And it was a conservative case for gay marriage. So maybe you're not as anti-marriage as you think, and I suspect, but there is a real class split, and we could talk all day. Putnam and others have done some fascinating work on this. Marriage is becoming more and more an upscale privilege, that this is kind of aggravating the class cleavages in our society. And I think my conservative friends are not willing to look enough at how some of these problems are created by economics. But I think we liberals are sometimes reluctant to look at how family structure does very much affect inequality. And again, it's one of those discussions that I wish we might come together on, because there are two truths here, and each reinforces the other, and we need a more constructive conversation about it. Gender splits. This election, if Obama wins, he's going to be the president of women. It's remarkable. The most striking number I've seen, one of the most striking numbers I've seen, there's a poll in Florida that showed Barack Obama ahead by 20 points among women and behind by 3 points among men. Now that's amazing. We've had gender gaps since 1980, but this one I think is going to be like no other gender gap we've ever seen, which raises some really fascinating questions. And you saw it among you guys in this survey. Millennial women, 56% held a favorable view of the Democratic Party. Millennial men, 44%. That's in your generation alone, which is not in some ways as divided as the rest of us. So gender will be with us for a long time. The last thing I want to say, and I could say these were just great comments, and I felt very privileged, honest, to be with you today. A lot of you talked about anti-institutionalism in your generation, and as I was thinking of my committee for the next greatest generation, it occurred to me one of the metaphors I've had in my head for a long time is the similarity of your generation to the generation right before the progressive era, the Jane Addams generation, 1890, 1900, where lots and lots of people went into settlement houses and other forms of service in poor neighborhoods, and they started out wanting to do one-on-one service, and they did a lot of good work that way. Many of them were actually Christian, motivated by Christian values. And over time, they realized that to achieve the change they wanted to achieve, they needed institutional change and not simply one-on-one work. A lot of them became Teddy Roosevelt progressives. A lot of them were at Teddy Roosevelt's Progressive Party convention, including Jane Addams. But the other thing that happened in that period is, and Bob Putnam, again, to go back to Putnam, has written about this, a lot of the organizations that are still important in our country, ranging from the NAACP to the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the Red Cross. It's a very long list of organizations. They were all formed in the period roughly 1890 to 1920, and it coincided with this period of public engagement that I think began in those settlement houses and those other movements. And I think you may not be so much anti-institutionalist as aware that the institutions that we do have are rather old and do not have a good enough fit with either your experience or the problems of the society. And so the paradox, somebody mentioned paradox, and irony and paradox are my favorite terms. The last paradox that I will put on the table is your very anti-institutionalism may reflect an awareness that you actually need to build new institutions, or you need to take old institutions and reform them, make them more relevant to the moment. Relevance is a kind of cheap, I always think of stupid 60s debates when I hear the word relevance, but it is appropriate, I guess, is a better word, that, to take these institutions and make them more appropriate to your circumstance. So I want you to make yourselves the greatest generation. I want you to create a whole bunch of new institutions, and we're at Georgetown. St. Ignatius of Loyola, somebody once asked, what should we do? And he said, do what you are doing. I think you're all doing a good job. Thank you so very much.